For more than a century, scientists believed one of humanity's greatest mysteries had already been solved. The first Americans came from Asia. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Stone tools, ancient campsites, the remains of a vast land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. During the last ice age, falling sea levels exposed Beringia, a frozen corridor linking two continents. At some point, small bands of hunter-gatherers crossed it, eventually becoming the ancestors of every indigenous people across North and South America. It was one of humanity's greatest migrations. Case closed, or so it seemed. Hidden inside that familiar story was a question no one could answer. Who were those people before they became the first Americans? That single question changed everything. Saying the first Americans came from Asia sounds precise. It isn't. Asia covers nearly a third of Earth's landmass and has been home to countless peoples for tens of thousands of years. Saying someone's ancestors came from Asia is a little like saying they came from Europe. It's technically true, but it tells you almost nothing about who they really were. For generations, archaeologists searched for the missing answer. They uncovered spear points buried beneath ancient soil, campfires frozen beneath layers of sediment, and the bones of long-extinct animals hunted by people whose names have been lost forever. Every discovery revealed another piece of the journey. None revealed where that journey truly began. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. Not through archaeology, through DNA. Unlike artifacts, DNA never stops traveling. Every generation passes it on, carrying tiny mutations that act like timestamps across history. Every migration, every separation. Every encounter between different peoples leaves a signature hidden inside our cells. Every human being carries that record. Scientists simply learned how to read it. At first, the new evidence appeared to confirm everything they already believed. The investigation began with mitochondrial DNA, inherited almost exclusively through maternal lines. Because it changes slowly over time, it became one of the first reliable tools for tracing ancient ancestry. When researchers examined indigenous populations from Alaska to Patagonia, they found something remarkable. Nearly all belonged to just 5 major maternal lineages. 4 of them, known as haplogroups A, B, C, and D, were already common throughout Asia, exactly what scientists expected. Another confirmation that the ancestors of Native Americans had come from somewhere in Asia before crossing Beringia. Then they found the 5th lineage, haplogroup X. Unlike the others, it appeared only rarely in East Asia. Instead, related forms also appeared in Europe and the Middle East. Suddenly, a mystery emerged where none was supposed to exist. If the first Americans really came from East Asia, why did one of their oldest maternal lineages seem to point somewhere else? Speculation arrived almost immediately. Some proposed forgotten Atlantic crossings long before Columbus. Others imagined Ice Age Europeans reaching North America thousands of years before recorded history. The theories were dramatic. The evidence wasn't. The problem wasn't a lack of ideas. The problem was that scientists were trying to reconstruct an entire human migration from a tiny fragment of the genome. It was like trying to understand an entire novel after reading a single paragraph. They needed the rest of the story. Fortunately, technology had finally caught up with the question. Whole genome sequencing changed everything. Instead of examining one inherited fragment, scientists could now read almost the entire genetic record carried inside every cell. It was the difference between looking through a keyhole and walking through the front door. Ancient skeletons suddenly became witnesses. People who had been silent for 20,000 years could finally tell their story. And one child buried deep in Siberia would change the investigation forever. The breakthrough came nearly 6,000 miles from the Americas. Near Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young boy who had died roughly 24,000 years ago. To the people who buried him, he was simply a child. To modern science, he became one of the most important individuals ever sequenced. Today, he is known as the Malta boy. When researchers extracted his DNA, they expected another familiar result. If the accepted migration model was correct, his genome should resemble the East Asian populations long associated with the ancestors of Native Americans. It didn't, not even close. Instead, his DNA belonged to a population scientists hadn't even known existed. They called them the ancient North Eurasians. They weren't East Asian, they weren't European. They represented a distinct Ice Age population that had largely disappeared from history. Then came the discovery that changed everything. When researchers compared the Malta genome with populations around the world, one pattern kept appearing. Native Americans shared a substantial portion of their ancestry with him, not a trace, a significant ancestral component. Suddenly, the old migration model no longer seemed complete. Until then, the story had appeared straightforward. One population, one migration, Asia, then America. The DNA revealed something far more complex. Long before anyone crossed Beringia, long before the first footsteps reached Alaska, two ancient populations had already come together. One carried East Asian ancestry, the other carried ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Somewhere in northern Asia, those histories merged. The ancestors of Native Americans were descendants of both. The question was no longer whether they came from Asia. That had never really changed. The real mystery had become far more interesting. Where did these two ancient worlds come together? Finding the answer required one of the largest genetic comparison projects ever attempted. Researchers assembled genomes from across Asia: Han Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Mongolians, Tibetans, Kazakhs, Yakuts, indigenous Siberian peoples, thousands of individuals, millions of genetic markers. One by one, the results arrived. China wasn't the closest match. Japan wasn't either. Neither was Korea. Every comparison eliminated another expectation. Instead of becoming clearer, the mystery grew deeper. If none of the obvious candidates matched, who did? Again and again, one unexpected region rose quietly to the top. Not a famous civilization, not one of Asia's great population centers. A remote mountain range few people outside genetics had ever heard of. The Altai Mountains. Every comparison eliminated another possibility. China, Japan, Korea, until the evidence kept pointing back to the same place, the Altai. Stretching across modern Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China, these mountains have long formed one of Eurasia's great crossroads. For thousands of years, people moving across northern Asia would have passed through this region. Different hunting traditions, different cultures, different ancestries. If East Asian populations and ancient North Eurasians were ever going to meet, this is exactly the kind of landscape where it could have happened. Among all the living populations included in these comparisons, groups from the Altai region consistently showed the strongest overall genetic similarity to Native Americans. Not because anyone expected that answer, because that's where the genetic trail led, but it's important to understand what that actually means. It does not mean today's Altai peoples are the direct ancestors of Native Americans. 20,000 years of migration, isolation, and population mixing make such a simple relationship impossible. Instead, they preserve the closest living genetic echoes of an ancient population that no longer exists in its original form. It's like hearing the last notes of a song whose beginning has long since disappeared. Piece by piece, the investigation was reconstructing a forgotten chapter of human history. But extraordinary discoveries demand confirmation. Could this remarkable new picture be confirmed? Not by another ancient skeleton from Siberia, but by someone who had actually lived in the Americas? It could. The answer had been buried beneath the plains of Montana for more than 12,000 years. In 1968, construction workers near Wilsall uncovered the grave of a young child buried alongside more than 100 carefully crafted stone and antler artifacts. Long before DNA could be extracted, archaeologists recognized the discovery as extraordinary. The burial belonged to the Clovis culture, one of the earliest and most widespread archaeological traditions in North America. For decades, it remained one of archaeology's greatest treasures. Then genetics caught up. Scientists successfully sequenced the child's genome. Today, he is known as Anzac 1. He lived approximately 12,600 years ago, close enough to the first generations of Americans that his DNA still preserved their genetic signature. For the first time, researchers possessed something remarkable. Not just the DNA of living indigenous peoples, not just the DNA of ancient Siberians, but the genome of one of the earliest known Americans. If the new genetic model was wrong, this child would expose it. Instead, he confirmed it. When Anzac 1's genome was compared with indigenous populations across North and South America, the connection was unmistakable. He belonged to the ancestral population from which later Native American peoples descended. Then researchers compared his DNA with populations across Eurasia. The pattern remained. Once again, the strongest living similarities pointed toward populations associated with the Altai region and the broader Northern Asian ancestry already emerging from previous studies. At that moment, the investigation changed. No longer was the conclusion resting on a single remarkable discovery. Independent lines of evidence were beginning to converge. Archaeology, ancient DNA, modern genomes. different methods, the same conclusion. That is when scientific confidence truly grows. Not because one experiment produces an exciting result, but because entirely different approaches independently tell the same story. There was still one loose end. Haplogroup X. For years, it had been the greatest challenge to the traditional migration model. If related forms appeared in Europe and the Middle East, did that mean ancient people had crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus? Whole genome sequencing finally answered the question. Ancient North Eurasians already carried forms of haplogroup X thousands of years before the peopling of the Americas. As their descendants spread across Eurasia, some branches moved west, others moved east. The similarities between Native Americans and populations farther west were not evidence of a forgotten Atlantic migration. They reflected a much older shared ancestry. The mystery wasn't solved by adding another migration. It was solved by looking further back in time. That has become one of the defining lessons of ancient DNA. The deeper scientists look into the past, the further back the answers move. What once appeared to be separate mysteries often become different chapters of the same story. Seen together, the evidence now formed a coherent picture. Somewhere between roughly 25,000 and 20,000 years ago, populations carrying East Asian ancestry encountered ancient North Eurasians somewhere in northern Asia. Over many generations, they blended into a new ancestral population. Later, some of their descendants gradually moved northeast into Beringia. But Beringia was never simply a bridge. For thousands of years, it was home. Families raised children there. Hunters adapted to one of the harshest climates on Earth. Generation after generation lived in isolation, gradually developing a distinct genetic identity before changing climates finally opened the routes into Alaska. Only then did one of humanity's greatest migrations truly begin. Within just a few thousand years, their descendants spread across 2 continents. They reached the Arctic, the Great Plains, the forests and deserts of North America, the Andes, the Amazon, and eventually the windswept southern tip of Patagonia. One founding population, thousands of cultures, countless languages, and throughout that extraordinary journey, their DNA carried the memory of where the story had truly begun. History has a way of feeling permanent. Once a story enters textbooks, museums, and classrooms, it is easy to believe the mystery has been solved forever. But history is never finished. It evolves with every discovery. Sometimes a single artifact changes our understanding of an entire civilization. Sometimes an ancient burial reshapes a dynasty, and sometimes the answers have been with us all along. That's exactly what happened here. For generations, scientists believed they already understood the origins of the first Americans. In the broadest sense, they were right. The ancestors of Native Americans came from Asia. Ancient DNA did not overturn that conclusion, it refined it. Instead of asking whether the first Americans crossed from Asia, science finally answered the more difficult question. Who were they before they became the first Americans? The answer proved far richer than anyone expected. Not one people, not one migration, but thousands of years of movement, encounters, adaptation, and survival across northern Asia. Long before anyone crossed Beringia, another story had already unfolded. A story archaeology alone could never fully reconstruct. Archaeology can tell us where people lived, what they hunted, what they left behind. DNA can tell us who they were. Together, those 2 disciplines accomplished something neither could have achieved alone. Archaeology traced the journey. Genetics identified the travelers. The Malta boy revealed a forgotten population that had disappeared from history. ANZIC 1 showed that the earliest Americans still carried that ancient legacy. The mystery of haplogroup X, once used to support extraordinary theories, found a simpler and far more convincing explanation. And when researchers compared Native American genomes with populations across Asia, the evidence repeatedly led to one unexpected region, the Altai Mountains. Not because anyone expected that answer, not because it fit an existing theory, but because that is where the genetic evidence consistently pointed. That is how science usually moves forward, not by replacing one story with another, but by sharpening the picture, one discovery at a time. The story of the first Americans is a perfect example. Archaeology revealed the root. DNA revealed the ancestry. Together, they uncovered a human story far more remarkable than either discipline could have told alone. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside this investigation. The most important discoveries rarely prove that everything we believed was wrong. More often, they reveal that reality is deeper, more connected, and more fascinating than we imagined. More than 20,000 years have passed since the ancestors of the first Americans began the journey that would eventually populate 2 continents. Empires rose and fell, languages appeared and disappeared. Entire civilizations vanished without leaving a written word, yet one record endured, not carved into stone, not preserved inside monuments, not written in books. It survived inside living cells. For thousands of years, every generation carried a silent record of that extraordinary journey without realizing it. Only recently have we learned how to read it, and perhaps that is the most remarkable discovery of all. History remembers what civilizations leave behind. DNA remembers the people who came before civilization itself.